Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm really excited today to have the two Jennifers on the podcast, Jennifer Settle and Jennifer Griffin, my friends from the world of architecture and new urbanism. Thanks so much for joining me. How annoyed are you when people call you the Jennifers?
Great. It's great.
We love it. It's even better when people confuse us.
It makes us seem like we're doing even more work because they don't know which one of us did it, and it doesn't matter. I'll take it.
Yeah, it's like we're one Jennifer, but we have twice as much manpower, women power, I should say. Yeah.
Well, there you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, I think for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm going to just call you Griffin and Settle, so we can keep it straight as to who's talking. I do want to make sure. So I really wanted to have you both on today because when I had Mike Keene on a few weeks ago, we had this conversation that he got into sort of talking about pre-approved plans and the work that you all had done in South Bend. And I really want to dive into that a little more deeply with the two of you. But before we do that, I want to make sure people who don't know you know who you are. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, I've known both of you for a while. And talk about like where you are now, what you're doing, and how you got to the kind of work that you're doing today. And I think we'll just start with Griffin.
Okay, awesome. How far back do you want to go? I can start with like early childhood.
There you go. If that's where it needs to go, then that's where it needs to go. I could actually, often when people ask me, like, how did you get into architecture, right? I grew up in just outside of Pittsburgh and in a just traditional 80s suburban community. We were known, like I think in high school, our town built, I think, the McDonald's with the largest, it's like statue of a hamburger in it or something like that. I mean, it was one of those, like totally nondescript landscape. No sidewalks, but we did have like this older downtown that was it's Irwin is the town, and it was built before the advent of cars. I just remember as a kid going down there and just something about it. Like anytime our community had an event or a celebration, 4th of July parade, Christmas celebrations, that sort of thing, it was like everyone went there, and there was something special about that. I think early on that I think you can feel, right? Even young kids that led me to just want to know how to kind of create those places. And it had some really good old housing stock too. Some great houses and, tight up on the sidewalk and the friends that lived down there is like, it just seemed like another world, right? Like you guys can walk to a store and stuff like that. And so I think that just was always in my mind going. And then Jen and I are both actually graduates of the University of Notre Dame. I'm a double domer. Jen got her grad degree somewhere else. So I went both for undergrad and graduate, and then they lured me back, and I've been on faculty there before. So I try to make it back whenever I can. But then early on in my career, I worked abroad. I worked in London, and my husband and I, we kind of like dotted around different places, worked in New York City and Washington, D.C. And then we finally started having kids. And it was kind of that moment of like, are we going to continue to live in these big cities that are walkable and have all these amenities and are great? Or are we going to maybe kind of take what we know and move closer to family? And so that's how we ended up in Tulsa. My husband is from Tulsa, has a huge family here. And we just said, we want to dedicate and root ourselves in a place that we're just going to kind of do as much as we can to kind of create those kind of environments for our kids and our family here. So, started my practice about 10 years ago. Actually, it was a year before we moved here, I started the practice. And my work is, I'd say ideally 50% local and 50% elsewhere in the U.S. and abroad. And it ranges on all scales. So I was talking to Jen earlier, but, I just wrapped up some consultant work on a 12,000 acre master plan to going to be starting up some live work infill units here in the fall. So kind of, and then, some zoning and code stuff with Jen and elsewhere. So it's kind of, I got hands in everything. So that's my background. And I'll pass it off to Jen.
How often I have to ask, how often do you take your kids to the gathering place?
Oh, we live literally 5 minutes from it. So we are like midway between downtown Tulsa and the gathering place. And we bought our house, I think it was like a year or two before the gathering place opened. And it's amazing. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So if anybody has not been to Tulsa, has not seen the gathering place, you'll have to make a trip.
Yeah. I mean, we're actually going to make a road trip down there in late October just to do that. It's
nice.
It's the most unbelievable park, with kids in mind that you've ever seen in your life. It's incredible.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
All right, Settle, you're up.
All right. Well, I don't know that I'll go as far back as Jen necessarily, but no, always have been an urbanist, grew up in a lot of different locations and was always curious about what makes different places connect, right, to you and to your, love of place and things like that. But I am senior associate with Opticos Design and lead of our Chicago office, which we opened about a year ago, exactly, actually. Mm-hmm. But before that, had my own practice. I'm based in Oak Park, in Chicago, for anyone who doesn't know Oak Park, Illinois. But had a practice doing zoning and master planning for about 5-6 years before that. And that gave Jen and I lots of opportunities to connect and partner with other sort of amazing urbanists and just tackle projects, right, where there was a need. And so it was really through that work when I was partnering with Incremental Development Alliance. I think that's where we last met, Kevin, in Kansas City. Through that work that I was obviously, like Jen said, coming from Notre Dame, having family in that area, knew of the city and a lot of what they were doing and the great leadership they had there, but really got back on the ground and in the conversation through Incremental Development Alliance and started this relationship with South Bend that really led to some amazing work over, a course of 4 or 5 years, just trying to build off and chip away at some of the barriers and housing issues that they were dealing with. And so super excited to talk about some of that. But then about a year ago, right, I think we all recognize the need for housing issues have reached the forefront of cities' minds. And so there was really a need for firms that were looking into these issues that focused on both zoning and design. And Opticos does that really well. I had worked with them 15 years ago out in California. We had kind of been ruminating on this idea of starting an office here, and it kind of worked well in terms of timing for both of us about a year ago. And so since then have just been dove headfirst into their great body of work, and really focusing on missing middle housing, zoning reform, and all that good stuff. And so that's sort of rambling introduction.
No, that's true. That's
so where we're at.
I appreciate that. So tell me about then, how did the two of you end up with the first project that you worked on together? How did that come about? And what was that?
Yeah. So Jen and I know, we have known each other for a long time, all the way back to Notre Dame, right? Yeah. Undergraduate days, and have always been an admirer of her work. And then, so when I got involved in jumping into South Bend's zoning code update, was one of the bigger projects early on in my LLC days that I took on, and so was looking for support. And I don't remember where we first sort of reconnected, Jen. I think we were sort of running in similar circles.
Yeah, I think we reconnected. We first kind of chatted when you were interested in kind of going off on your own. And I had just done it a couple years prior. And so there was just as two, female parents trying to start a business, we kind of connected. And then just from that, as work came up. And I think the first full-on project that we did, officially, that we plugged into together was the zoning code update in the city that you got with the city of South Bend. Which was fantastic. No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
so it was a good time. We had been, yeah, that's right. We had connected as sort of just supporting each other and growing a network of truly, women that were sort of cared about urban design, backgrounds in architecture, and were doing this type of work. And so whenever we needed extra hands or capacity, would connect. And certainly Jen was a mentor on that work of establishing and building my work there. And then when South Bend came, had some opportunities to bring her great graphic skills into that. And then, of course, when the city, when we finished up the zoning code update and the city sort of came and said, all right, we want to do pre-approved buildings. And I was like, well, I know someone who is sort of the best at architecture. My focus had been really, on zoning and urbanism. And I said, well, I know Jen, that's her sweet spot, right, on the architecture side. And so we went in on that project together, full force.
I should say Jen is very modest. She's like, she's fully capable of all realms, but it's always fun to work together. So whenever we find the opportunity to do so,
yes, but I avoid construction documents at all costs.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not the fun part at all, that's for sure. So, I mean, it's a really cool story. I'm always interested. I can't help but be interested in how people come around to starting their own business, within this world. It's not easy. It's obviously a real challenge. And there's a lot of great aspects of being your own boss. There's also a lot of things that are really tough. Yeah. And I wonder if you could, maybe just for a minute, we could talk about that, sort of like the ups and downs of working for yourself.
Oh yeah. That's a whole other podcast.
How much? I know, right? Yeah. That's like it's a series.
I think, for me, and probably not too dissimilar for Jen, but when I worked for Opticos as sort of my start of my career, and it really solidified, right, this desire to work in this intersection between architecture and planning, and do those types of projects. And then for, a variety of reasons based on family and cost of living and all of those things, wanted to come back to the Midwest and get closer to family. And came here and worked in a really great architecture firm for a couple of years, but was really missing that scale of projects. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that here is driven by the regional planning, or the metropolitan planning agencies, and it's hard to tap into that work. Right. And I didn't necessarily want to be within that realm of work. And then, had a couple of kids, and it gets harder to make the 9 to 5 gigs and especially longer hours work. And it was, I really wanted to sort of step away and focus on just the projects that I was really passionate about, however they may come. And so was really fortunate to sort of take that risk and lean on folks who had done it before, both of yourselves included, right? So there is a path forward for that, especially within the urbanist world. And ever since I've been busy, and I think, but as those projects grew and grew and the impact was real, and kind of found my place in different partnerships, right? The ones that were really fruitful and exciting were the ones where I was able to work with others like Jen, and we could collaborate and come together and really sort of, it was one of the most efficient teams, right, you could possibly make, right? We were all working limited hours, but we're super passionate and spoke the same language, but bringing different skill sets, and we could do a lot. And so that was sort of the peak. I think the challenge, of course, is all the things we know about running your own business that you don't think about, right? The housekeeping and the overhead, the insurance, all of those things. And as projects, the opportunity, certainly after the zoning code update, there was opportunity to do larger, even more impactful projects. But with that comes the capacity, right? Limited capacity of just one person or leaning on each other. And so those are some of the biggest challenges, right? Is that capacity issue, and how do you build that network and do all the other, get paid and make the numbers work, right? And also protect your time in that situation, right? Because you become valuable as a single person who can come in and help do this work. That there's I think we started the conversation this way, Kevin, of there's a lot to say yes to and a lot of really exciting work. And we want to do it all. But yeah, so that's Jen, what else?
I think I think starting my own practice, it was my only alternative, right? So I did it when we were preparing to have our first child. And like you both, it's one of those things, what you do professionally doesn't feel like a job, right? You're very passionate about it. So it was like a vehicle for me to continue doing what I love, but also adding in that other element of life that I love, that I, was becoming a parent. And so it was like, I was not interested. It just gave me the freedom, the flexibility. And it's been, Jen, you guys know, it's a challenge, right? Because I'm still a, single person LLC. And so, there's no one that you can pass the baton to when you want to go on vacation or something, right? You gotta respond and that sort of thing. But I think what it's forced me to prioritize, right? I've been very blessed that I haven't had to spend a whole lot of time trying to get work. I think new urbanists and people with our architectural background, there's a good network out there of folks doing really good work. And once you kind of meet up and tap into those folks and connect with them, there's just a lot of possibility. And it's been nice because, when projects come along that just don't really seem like a great fit, I'm able to say, it's maybe not I'm maybe not the right person for this, and just kind of keep focused on the innovative work, like the pre-approved buildings and the zoning code updates and, infill, mixed use infill and stuff like that, if I was trying to float a larger company, I think would be challenging. I wouldn't have the bandwidth, but it would be challenging, right? I can just kind of pick and choose the work that I think is really going to move the needle and make an impact. So,
yeah. This conversation kind of reminds me of, there was a blog post that Aaron Wren just put out this week that talked about the difference between open networks and closed networks. And I think within the field of new urbanism, it's always been a remarkably open network. Because there really aren't a ton of us who do it. And I think we've always been willing to learn from each other and collaborate and, try to find ways to make the pie bigger. So I think that's really cool that you've both tapped into that.
I will say, oh, sorry, Kevin.
Go ahead.
No, I will say, I don't tell this story often, but I know Mike Keene has brought it up before as something we should promote, and I don't always, but I do think it is pretty amazing what we were able to accomplish. So on the South Bend zoning code, which ended up being a full rewrite, and the staff can't undersell them. They put together an amazing effort, but there were 4 part-time working moms that pulled that zoning code off in 18 months.
Yeah.
And that was the only people working on it except for city staff. And I think that just shows the power of what, urbanist, when you put a good team together, what you can accomplish.
There are entire large corporate firms that take 5 years to, do a zoning rewrite for a city.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. So you got hired to do this zoning code rewrite. Was the initial idea then that the city had an antiquated zoning code and it needed a total refresh, or where did that come from? Who was really pushing it from the city's end?
Yeah, so it started by the city brought in Incremental Development Alliance to really test and look at some of their zoning. And what came out of that was sort of a list of barriers that were preventing small scale development in their zoning. And so the city embarked on a really incredible effort, but to tackle some of those barriers incrementally and make incremental changes to their zoning code. So they had been working, and that was coming from Tim Corcoran and Michael DeVita at the city, and making those efforts based on recommendations that came out of the incremental development work. And then as that effort really gained support in large part from Mike Keene and what he's done for the local developers there, they gained enough, I think, success from those small changes to say, all right, we're ready and acceptance for sort of a zoning overhaul. And so that work was really about reformatting the entire code to be more usable and more friendly for local developers, and then to open up and really solidify this need for neighborhood infill, right? And so we sort of were able to build on the small amendments and really add to them and make them into a full new zoning code that was really easy to use, that had the development community in mind of how you would design and develop a project, and simplify it, right? Get rid of all that other stuff. They made some key changes, but then get rid of all the other stuff that didn't make sense. And so the premise for that whole project was really like, let's go through. I met with city staff on a monthly basis, and we would just tackle piece by piece of the code and sit down and say, does this regulation make sense? Do we need it? And so worked really closely with staff to sort of go through that and then reformat that. And so, you know, some of the key things were, of course, you know, eliminating parking minimums, creating a new zone specifically for that missing middle, neighborhood infill, calibrating, you know, setbacks and subdivision ordinances for their local conditions. And so that was touched everything from A to Z in the zoning code to sort of align it with this idea that we want to promote neighborhood infill and sense of place, right? And so that was, and just make it as user friendly as possible. And so that was sort of where that work came out of. And it was really, the city took on the onus of really educating council, right? And meeting with a lot of small groups and building that support for those zoning. And it was the quietest council meeting adopting that code that I've ever been in. And it didn't feel right, that it didn't feel real, that there was no, because they had sort of taken every opportunity to bring everybody up to speed on small changes so that when the big picture thing came through, there were no surprises and it made sense. So it was a really great process.
I mean, that sounds like it, because it's so common in these efforts that you get bogged down in process and kind of lose sight of what it is you're actually trying to accomplish. And also there, you know, I always tell people for every regulation in a zoning code, there's a reason, there's a constituency for it. And there are real challenges in doing things like eliminating parking minimums. And even if I think they're the right thing to do, they can be really, really hard. Were there areas of significant pushback when you were working through all this, or were there one or two things that created more controversy?
Yes, but it was weird things. It wasn't exactly what you would expect. And I think it was sort of a testament to how they rolled it out in terms of those initial amendments, sort of tested the waters for a lot of changes. So with the parking minimums, you know, they eliminated them in their sort of neighborhood centers and tested it out and on some of their corridors and proved that it wasn't a problem. And then so when it got applied citywide, it didn't feel nearly as daunting to the community. And so there wasn't as much pushback as you would imagine on things like that. There was on some of like conditions for, you know, mixed use buildings for height, or the larger multi-family buildings on how it, you know, met the river, right? Things like that, setbacks for that, or requirements of sort of those bigger buildings that we were putting into play. Got a little bit of pushback from the development community, but not a ton, because one of the things that they really did that I think helped in that respect was that as they made these smaller changes and as we revised different sections of the zoning code, they vetted them with developers and their hardest developers, right? To say, how would you crack this, right? What gives you pause, you know, or what would you, you know, get frustrated with this with these different standards. And we received that immediate feedback before there was even a draft, right? And they were doing that with nonprofit developers, with community groups, and with different developers to say what, how does this feel to you? Does it make sense? And what were those areas that you would push back? And so we addressed them, and they really responded, right? At no point did they go to engagement with something, solidified or said we have to do it this way. It was really a response to that development community and the community at large, the neighborhood groups.
I think that goes to the point, an overarching theme in South Bend, and we joked with Tim before about this, but South Bend's tagline should just be incremental everything, right? They incremental development, incremental code update, incremental introduction of a pre-approved building program. I mean, you could just keep going through. I think one of their biggest successes has been the way they've reached out to the folks doing this work or striving to do this work in the community and getting them involved, right? And because of that, like Jen said, as they were, the first code amendments that they were making were things that were should have been done 10 years ago, right? It just wasn't an issue. So they were building trust, right, with the community, so that when they came with something that's a little bit more of a one that would cause some pause, they've had some of those relationships established. And they were building that rapport so they could have a meaningful conversation and talk about the pros and cons and figure out what the right calibration was to move forward. But I think that's really been one of their biggest success stories, just their process of going through and building, because in the process they've really kind of built up and supported the community in doing this work, right? Because they've involved them directly in the process as a meaningful participant and collaborator. So it's been cool to kind of see that.
I think that's a good segue too to the pre-approved. Okay. But go ahead, Kim.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder, you can let me know if you think this is right or wrong, but I wonder if also there are a couple of things that might have helped. One is, like I talked about with Mike, South Bend is not Austin, it's not Nashville, it's not a booming city. And so they're really looking for investment. They're really trying to make things work. They're trying hard. And then secondly, the scale of the community is, it's not a tiny city, but it's not a real big city either. So my guess is the people in city government have a much closer relationship with their citizens, the developers. They probably know who the people are a lot more intimately than say a really large city.
I think that's fair. It's a great scale.
Yeah, it's a great scale, but also some really good people in certain positions that both in the private and public and nonprofit side that realize there's so much this work to be done. Let's just help each other do it, which I think, when you get into a larger state, even in Tulsa, right, there's kind of this competition among local developers for land and for, who's got the next deal and who's getting the subsidy and who has to deal with the city. And there's less of that I've ever perceived, if any, in South Bend. It's just hey, there's so many sites to infill. We're all here to kind of support the city and support our community. Let's work together and do this, which is a fantastic environment to be a part of.
That's great. So let's dive into the pre-approved plan aspect. How did this conversation start, or who initiated this discussion?
Yeah. So as we were finishing up the zoning code, Tim Corcoran, who really sort of overarching lead on all of this work, at least formulating it and guiding it, he kind of said, right, I think Jen touched on it, but there's sort of this sense in South Bend of what do we need, right? And let's figure out how to get it done. They're not trying to check boxes or follow, some formulated or bureaucratic path. It's really what's the need. And so the zoning code was, I think, a huge success. But at the end of the day, the reality was, right, things were really tough to pencil out and get built, right? They had a lot of vacant land. Land cost is low. So they removed those regulatory barriers, but it was still a really tough sell to say, go develop all these small parcels. And so the idea of pre-approved buildings had been, starting to gain traction, I think, amongst the New Urbanist community and certainly within the Incremental Development Alliance. And so Tim really said, I want to do this. I want to do it specific for South Bend, and build as a way to build off the zoning code and really incentivize neighborhood infill, and provide economic opportunities for all the locals and groups that helped calibrate the code. So that's where it really came out of. Yeah.
I often, and I often talk about when Jen and I talk about, with communities, because we, folks have reached out to us from other communities and tell us about the pre-approves process and how do you develop a program, and when we talk about it, we always say it's like, look, this is no different than any other sort of subsidization or support, financial support tool to get development, the types of development the community wants to see. But the difference with that is that it's one that is really helps to democratize development, right? Like it's kind of one of those tools that, like, it's not a TIF. It's not something you need a legal team to sort out an agreement with the city to do, but it's a tool that helps to like overcome, which we were dealing with, like the appraisal gap, right? That like there hadn't been any new construction in these neighborhoods in a long time, and the existing buildings were not in great shape. And so, when they were trying to get comps, they couldn't. And so how could we lower that financial bar? And it was one of many tools, right, that the city has pursued and developed and that sort of thing. But it's one that's like totally open to anybody, right? You could be a developer and use it. You could be just someone who buys a lot and wants to build a house to use it, and like really kind of opens it up to anyone to really participate in that neighborhood revitalization, as well as pathways for building, local wealth for folks wanting to jump into that. So
I want to talk about a couple aspects of this. I hope you can, I know you can address, but just help me and others understand. One is the process you all used and to create a pre-approved plan process within city government. And then secondly is like, what is that interaction like from the standpoint of being a developer or somebody who wants to build one of these plans? So I wonder if you could talk about both of those perspectives.
Yeah. You want to take that, Jen, or do you want me? Or
I'll start and you can chime in. You can add to it, I'm sure. I think the basis of, coming off of the zoning code, we sat down with city staff and the local, community to say, what are the building types that we need, right? And there was sort of this understanding of what are the ones that have you been hearing nonprofit and developers are interested in building, what fits within. So the first part was sort of identifying a catalog of potential building types, right, that might work, and then looking at the lot sizes, right, and the neighborhood zones to see what fits on those lots and come up with building types that met that highest and greatest need. And then honing in on that. And the next piece was really doing some initial performas, right, to understand which would be the most beneficial and impactful, and get us closer to something that could be built. And so we looked at what would fit on lots and narrowed down the catalog of building types. And then we focused on, I think initially, 5 types that would be the best fit to start. Go ahead, Jen. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just say we started, I think, with 12 was like initial wish list, right? When we started talking to the city, started talking to the community, and we started talking to the city, and all, we were all talking as like all the missing middle types, right? Like let's do it all, right? And then there was a very intentional lot analysis process where we were looking at where do you want these most, where like you got to start somewhere. So what are the neighborhoods you would maybe most to apply these pre-approved buildings? And so did some lot analysis there to see what would fit, which also helped inform us the actual buildings that we ended up pursuing, like their actual width and their depth and what we could fit on the lot. It was like calibrated specific, because we found that in some of these neighborhoods, these uniquely narrow lots in some of them, like 33, 32 feet wide. So we knew we needed a product type that was going to fit that lot. So we couldn't just throw down like the standard 24-foot wide product type and make sure we had the 5-foot setback on each side and that sort of thing. So we need that. But then, yeah, I think it was the financial analysis process early on, which Jen mentioned, which was really, we had a team member that was running pro formas and said, look, you would like these 12, but there's only 5 that actually pencil out now, right? Now, in the future, and like anything, this is a living program that's going to be adapted and added to and that sort of thing. As new construction happens and comps become available, then we can continue to expand our palette of pre-approved buildings, which we actually have. We started with 5, and it ended up being 7 after the first go because there was some variations. There was some like increment in the plan. We did a narrow house with a 2-bed, and then we talked about, we added a kind of an ensuite onto the back of it that you could. So we ended up getting seven building types, and then shortly within I think probably 3 or 4 months of finishing that, came back with 2 additional building types that they had developers who were interested in building in these neighborhoods, and so we added those. And I think that's the intent of this, is that as opportunities arise to add these types, we will. But it was like, look, we're going to be realistic to start off the bat, because, the worst thing is to develop this really complex or intricate and tool and for nothing to happen. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they were very intentional. Like, we're going to make sure that, once we launch this, we've got things queued up and people ready to go. And it's actually, it's viable on all ends, financial and physical and everything like that.
Yeah. So we developed, we developed the designs, the initial schematic designs, and started building up the sets for those initial 5. And then we, cost vetted them, did cost estimates with the local lumberyard, with local builders, different local builders, to get multiple opinions. And we started to build those sets, everything from, a typical site plan condition, because of course the one requirement is that, a developer has to submit a site plan. But so we started developing the details of those designs. So we established the 5 building types that we would focus on. And then we started to put together the sets and look at how could we add variation. And so we started developing 3 different elevation options that kept the same exact building footprint to add some variety. And then we really vetted those through a cost estimate process, and we started made adjustments, right? And then the other piece we did was start to vet the construction details with local builders and trades to say, is this how you would build it? So that we could really get the most simple, efficient design that met that goal of, incentivizing better built outcomes, higher levels of design for these smaller, more affordable products. And so we would go back and forth, right? We'd get some feedback, and then we'd go back to the design to try to simplify it and craft an option that worked. And then once we got, I think, to a place where the building department planning had signed off on those designs, we started to put together a catalog that spoke to some of the reasons why we picked these designs, and gave some illustrations of what they might look like. And then worked with the city really closely to establish sort of what the process looked like. And I think that was to your second point, Kev, and your question was so the city did a lot of work with their Build South Bend program to establish, a website that walked people through the entire entitlement and development process and made it really easy. And so this sort of fed into that. So what is possible is that people can look at the catalog and say, oh, I want to do this building. And then they submit a form, right, essentially to the city that requests and tracks who's requesting these. And then they get the full architectural plans for that building. And so then when it comes time to permit, they submit a site plan, and they have to sort of fill out some information about which elevation option they're doing, what zoning district is within, and things like that. But otherwise, it's a pretty simple process.
How much does it cost an applicant to fill out that form and do all that?
Nothing more than the typical permit application fee.
Okay, yeah. So the city's not trying to charge for the plan. So then, but you all designed these buildings, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, I have to ask a boring kind of architectural
No,
business
you're not the first. I know where this is going.
question. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is like, so you don't get paid like on a per use basis for any of these?
No. So our contract with the city is that we granted the city of South Bend a non-exclusive license to use
Okay.
the permit plans for development projects within the city limits of South Bend. So they can use and distribute them to anybody who's going to be using them in the city of South Bend. So I know, and Tim Joseph is like, yeah, people keep calling me, or I've got an application who's someone who has a site like in somewhere in Michigan. I know.
Yeah.
So I was like, sorry, I can't share that, which just, in all honesty, obviously for, as a professional, it's like, it helps to, protect your business, but also as a liability thing too, right? Like these plans have not been vetted, though, with their codes and everything else. And which is interesting because we're developing one now for the city of Kalamazoo. And though they're both Midwest cities, there are some differences actually in terms of some of the details that we're showing in our drawings. So it also, obviously just protects the cities and the architects from any potential liability when applying to a jurisdiction that's not what its initial design for. I do want to go back real quick though and just mention, I think, and Jen mentioned this, but I just think it's really important for like any city or other folks that are listening who are interested in doing this, is that the process, as Jen mentioned, we were constantly kind of going back, both the city directly and our team going and talking to local builders and contractors and nonprofits and for-profits and asking their opinions and getting real numbers from them. And this, honestly, this was queuing them up because these were the first users, right? So they were fully, on board with this, and like they were bought in. So when it was launched, they were ready to go, right? We weren't doing this in a room or in a side or in a vacuum, and which was like, you launch, you're like, here you go. And they're like, developers just kind of like, well, I don't know about this product type, and it might not meet my market clientele or whatever, so I think that's really important. And then I think the other thing that's really important too is doing this, like we had to take our designer and architect hats off a lot as a part of it and understand the finances. Like, right, like we could design much more elaborate and intricate buildings, but we were in neighborhoods that were just really struggling to make anything pencil out. So I know, like we went through, I think it was like the Narrow House in particular, Jen, like Jim had ran a pro forma initial permit. We were just off of it penciling out. So we like shaved 2 feet off of it to get the square footage down so that, right. And the details these were all very simple boxes, right? We just wanted to make sure the proportions and whatever. And really the public front was what looked best, and everything had a front porch and that sort of thing. So how can we do that as simply and cost effectively as possible? So that these buildings, because in the end, like, how can we get these buildings built, in these neighborhoods? So I think those are important.
So let me ask you a couple of other just basic questions on this. So then I see this catalog on the website, and let's say I own a vacant lot. I go and I pick one, I fill out the form, and I choose the elevation that I want it to have. At that point, then you're basically through a zoning and a building permitting review, more or less. Is that, just to clarify for anybody who hasn't thought about this before, that's the idea?
Yeah, so you still submit it as you would a normal permit application, but the timeline for review is really a couple of days, right? One day, maybe. They've already sort of reviewed and vetted it. And the savings is really, right, you don't have to go through that architectural design process.
Right.
Right, and you get a good outcome that's calibrated for lots. And so South Bend already had a fairly streamlined permitting process. And so some cities have used pre-approved projects to really shorten that timeline of review. And I think it does in South Bend as well, but the goal was really to elevate the design outcomes and reduce those soft costs.
Right, because you're getting buildings that look like they fit in the historic neighborhoods of South Bend.
Mm-hmm. And that are easy that they've been cost vetted, right?
Yeah.
For maximum simplicity and efficiency, but still look good. And that's something where people really struggled.
Yeah. I think too, so some of these types, there were some neighborhoods, right, that they heard duplex, sixplex, and it, we're just like, oh, I don't, because there were some really bad examples that had been built, within the city of South Bend. And I think it helped any kind of NIMBYism overcoming that, because they were able to show them, like, this is what, I remember Liz we had a call with one of the city planners, and she was like, yeah, we were talking to some neighborhood folks, and we were mentioning duplexes, and they were, this one lady was getting kind of nervous, and she showed them what we were working. I think it was the stack duplex we were looking at, and she was like, "Oh no, I'd like that in my neighborhood." So it was like it helps to overcome any concern or hesitation with folks about what a other than single family house would look like in their neighborhood. So it kind of overcomes that as well. And so developers obviously they know that they're not going to get pushback from the community if they're doing this as well. So
the other thing that I want to ask is, let's say that I look at the catalog and I'm like, oh, I really like this house design, but I want to change the kitchen layout. I want to maybe do a 6-foot bump out on the back to make the bedroom bigger. How does that work?
We knew there was going to be a lot of that, and that was our main concern, even going to the project with the city, of saying, how are you going to deal with people that want to change these? And we've definitely had some lessons learned. We did through that process, we identified very clearly things that you could change and things that you couldn't, right? And so some of the supplemental materials to the actual building set lays out, okay, you can change, some things within the footprint in terms of a door location, or, whether or not you want this closet or not. We don't really care, right? As long as it's structurally sound, and obviously, that's on the onus of the contractor to do those good practices. But we did say, right, we identified within the sets, there are some windows, right? You can remove non-egress windows on the rear and the side of a property if you're not facing a street, to reduce some of those costs, right? Because windows can be one of the biggest costs. You can remove the trim on the back of the building if it's really that tight, right? So but you can't ever do that on the front of the building, right? You can't ever remove the porch. You can use different materials, right? So if we said ideally, a couple of the things I can mention, Jen, you probably have more, but we put details in there to use 2x6 walls, right? That are better insulation and more structurally. But if you had to go down to 2x4s and that met all of your codes, that's okay, as long as you're not changing that building footprint. We recommend using cement board siding or hardy board siding. If you have to use vinyl, right, to cost save, that's okay, right? Those changes are allowed, but you can't change window and door placement or removal of a porch, the things that we know contribute to a good urban environment and neighborhood character. And so that's we tried to lay that out best as possible. There's certainly been a request, and that's something that, Jen, you can speak to, but that we're working through. And I think that's one of the questions that cities are grappling with, and people that are doing pre-approved plans are grappling with. What does that process look like?
Yeah, I think, the city, like I said, it's a good size. So when these come up, they've been able to handle them. They've reached out to us whenever there's been a question about, what do you all think if they change this or that sort of thing. But we haven't run into anything major that has caused us pause, that we haven't been able to respond to give people the answers that they're looking for.
How do the local architects interact with this process, and are you, they or others, or are you looking to add plans to the pre-approved list?
So for the city of South Bend, like Jen listed, we've added this 1-story cottage because that was a request. We've added the side-by-side duplex, and we failed to mention we work with the other person on our team. So Jim Kuman was running the cost analysis, but we also worked with Patrick
Lynch, yeah.
Thank you. Patrick Lynch, who's a local South Bend architect on the sixplex in particular, because that's one that will have to be stamped by a local engineer or architect. And he worked with us very closely. He was coming from a background of working with the South Bend Heritage Foundation, so understood some of the process and methodologies of nonprofit developers and some of their concerns, and was really a huge voice in understanding local codes, construction techniques. And so he was on our team developing these plans and talking through them. And I think the hope is, I mean, other places have done it different ways, right? These can be a pretty big upfront cost for cities if they're trying to do them like South Bend and tackle 5 buildings. Other cities have done them where, you put a competition out and local firms submit and build off of those. So I think there's many different ways to approach it, all with different benefits and challenges to both the designer and the city in terms of cost and liability and things like that. I think the hope with South Bend, especially for the sixplex, right? Because one of the things we didn't talk about is I think pre-approved buildings are ideal for the IRC buildings. Yeah. And they've worked really well. It's a lot trickier to go into that missing middle scale, which of course we want to advocate for, because you need that local, that you need the engineer or architectural stamp. And so the idea was that these provided an avenue for pre-reviewed plans, but they also provided an inspiration and a concept, a proof of concept for what a sixplex could look like in South Bend and what the numbers might look like, what a duplex. And so that it more local designers and architects and developers could build off of that. And hopefully any variations that come of this could also be, adopted in the future as pre-approved.
Right. Okay. And how's the uptake been so far? How many are you able to track? Like how many people have used it?
Yeah, it's they've had a lot of inquiries. There is one that might have already been completed in construction currently, and then another, I believe, that's either started or will start soon. They launched the program earlier this year, and then there was just a recent release that a nonprofit developer is pursuing a scattered site TIF, I think it is, and is going to be using these on 37 sites. And it was really interesting because we heard from Tim Corcoran. And when we found out about this, he said, and the comment from the nonprofit developer was like, this project wouldn't have been viable if we didn't have these pre-approved plans available. It just would have been too cost burdensome to develop these plans ourselves. So that was really great to hear. Makes you feel like you're, the 18 months or whatever we spent, developing this, that they're actually being useful and helpful and helping the community, provide that infill housing.
That's great. All right. Well, I know time is a little tight here for all of us today. I hate to, I'm sure I have more questions, but we can always, we could try to do it again sometime. This is, I think, a really great introduction for people to the whole concept of pre-approved plans. And I presume that you have a website that has like the catalog that I could share as well.
Yes. Yeah. The South Bend has their pre-approved program has a website with all of their, all that information on it.
All right. And I'll definitely put that in the show notes as well.
Okay.
So. I like to end by asking each of my guests just a real quick question. I call this the Messy City Podcast. And so I like to ask people when I say that phrase of Messy City, like something what comes to mind for you? Is there a place, a neighborhood, a city or a town that has that sort of less planned, more organic, for lack of a better word, feeling that describes sort of a messy place? What might come to mind for you? I'll start with Jen Settle.
No, that's an easy one for me. My family is from, and I was born outside of New Orleans, and that's the best example of a messy city that's just unmatched, right?
That has probably been my number one answer so far. You'll be happy to know.
Well, that's good to know. But my roots are there, and that's where my love of both architecture and urbanism comes from. So
That's terrific. What about you, Jen?
Yeah, that's Jen's got, that was my one of my initial thoughts. But ultimately, I think really for me, I just think about my own community, and I think when you go beyond just the physical messiness of place, just all the things that are interacting to make a place home, and so the people, the culture, the built environment, the food, and so I think those are always contributing. So I'd have to say, it's just, I think about, my own neighborhood and all the pieces that make it up. And though it's messy, it's beautiful. So, things can be great and messy at the same time. Sometimes the best stuff is messy. So
you're speaking my language. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you both so much for this. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to learning more and talking more. I think this whole pre-approved plan thing is it's an incredibly important deal. Almost everywhere I go, people are talking about it. And I think it has a lot of promise for the future. So thanks for the work that you're doing and for sharing a little bit about it here today.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Kevin.
You bet.